everyone, I'm Amanda Fountain. I'm president of the PR Club this year, and I'm so happy to have you all joining us for our first panel this season. We have a great panel put together for you, and I'd love to hear more from you guys on other panels. Please reach out at any time. Before kicking things off, just a couple of ground rules for the webinar. Please ask questions throughout. Use the chat function to send us anything. We will make sure that they get answered throughout or at the end. And then at the very end, when we've kind of gone through our moderated topics, we'll allow you to come off mute to ask questions live. If we're not seeing you to get you off mute, just raise your hand or use the chat functions and I will unmute you. For now, I would like to introduce you to Nicole Metro. She's our moderator for today and an account director at V2 Communications. So she'll kick off, and thank you so much, Nicole.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to the whole PR Club for organizing this. I know we're all really excited to be here today. So as Amanda mentioned, my name is Nicole Metro, and I'm an account director at V2 Communications. And early on in the pandemic, we did a media landscape report to kind of understand how COVID was impacting the reporters that we worked with. We used this to help guide our clients' communication strategies during what we thought was then a very complicated news cycle, but has actually only gotten more complicated as the year has gone on. So in the fall, we decided to refresh that, and we looked at not only COVID, but some of the new trends that had emerged, such as the crazy election cycle, the massive social justice movement that really swept the nation, and the global fight against climate change. We talked to reporters, we dissected different articles, and we also analyzed share of voice, all of which taught us that while COVID is still the #1 trending topic, the way it was being talked about had actually changed. What was originally a news cycle focused on the immediate impacts of the virus had shifted to focus on the long-term implications on the economy, on businesses, on people, and also hearing firsthand from the responders and people on the front lines who were dealing with the COVID, who were dealing with the crisis firsthand. Ultimately, all of this taught us that this is one of the craziest news cycles we've ever seen, and certainly unlike anything any of us have ever experienced before, which is why we brought together this expert panel to help you, your companies, and your clients navigate that. If you're interested in learning more about the V2 report, you can download it from our website, or you can reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to send you a copy. In the meantime, I think that's enough from me, so we can turn it over to our panelists and maybe start with Melissa, my colleague. Why don't you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Melissa Mahoney. I'm a senior vice president at V2 Communications, based in Boston, but with global clients. I personally focus on a lot of enterprise tech, clean tech, and VC-oriented clients. I also lead V2's crisis communications practice. So I look at the issues that we've been faced with this year with maybe a different lens, and I'm excited to talk about that today.
Awesome. Malcolm, how about you?
So my name is Malcolm Johnson. I'm a journalist, storyteller with NBC Boston. I've worked there just short of 3 years, and COVID-19 has really taken control over how we tell stories, I think in a positive way and in a negative way, but we work with PR firms firsthand on a daily basis, and with that engagement, I think I'm able to lend some tips maybe on how you guys can break through to us journalists. Yeah,
absolutely. Would love to hear that. And I know we're waiting on one more panelist, but we can kind of get started while we wait for Drew to join us. Oh, here he is. Hey, Drew, how are you?
Hey, guys. Sorry for the technical snafu, but I have arrived.
No worries, no worries.
I heard your introductions. I was on the audience side, but now I'm on the panelist side.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Do you want to just start by introducing yourself then?
Sure. My name's Drew Oliveira. I'm the head of digital marketing and strategy at Little Gem Resorts, which is an owner and operator of boutique resort hotels on Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and we're developing a new resort down in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Awesome. So to start, I think, all of us would really love to hear how the past year has impacted each of you and kind of the way that you've worked with, clients, your different audiences. And Malcolm, I think maybe you firsthand as a person and a reporter, navigating this news cycle and making sure you're getting stories out to your audience. What was that like?
In terms of getting the stories out, what was getting the stories out like?
Yeah, and just navigating, how all of the news that was coming out at such a rapid pace and making sure that you were able to kind of and articulate it to NBC Boston's audiences?
Yeah, I think we've just had to keep our head on a swivel, and we've had to really focus in on all of the different news that's coming in. The pace that it's coming in is so fast and so rapid, and attention spans are decreasing by the day because the news is coming out so quickly. It was just this year that we were discussing potentially going to war with Iran, right? At the very beginning of the year. But it feels like it was 2 to 3 years ago when that attack was made on General Soleimani. And so I say, you really have to slow things down as much as you possibly can. And in doing so, you can give each news story its just due without rushing to the very next story. And really trying to give it all that it deserves, because each of the stories that have really led this news cycle over the past year, whether it is the political strife that we've seen, the division in thoughts within our country and how that has drawn the country to different sides in many ways, whether that is COVID-19, which is the biggest human health crisis that we've seen in generations, or whether that is racial injustice that is played out for lifetimes. Each of these stories deserves a journalist's heartfelt attention. And so I think I've tried to pay attention to each one of them with real passion and not look over any of them.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I can't imagine being in a newsroom and trying to keep up with everything coming in as rapidly as it is. So I think it's great that you guys have focused on slowing down and really digging in deep where it makes sense. And Drew, how about you? I mean, a luxury travel brand, obviously one of the most impacted, verticals this year. What was it like kind of working there, and especially being on top of in charge of social media?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you can imagine, for lack of better words, it was a very bleak spring that we had.
Yeah.
But one of our secret sauce ingredients in the hospitality world is turning positives into negatives. So we really had to sort of think about how to flip this into something that was a positive story for us, but could also inspire the type of activity that would recoup the losses we had on our books for the summer. We lost all of our spring. And we had a pretty bad, the festival season on Nantucket is a huge revenue driver for us. And as you can imagine, all of those festivals were gone. A lot of pre-bookings on our books for the summer, which we lost as well. So we were in a position where we had to really think about how do we get people thinking about summer and the joys and sort of the heartwarming pieces of it. To get them, their brain primed for when the moment was right to start advertising again, to have us right on the top of their minds. So it was tough. We ended up using social media as a great vehicle for sort of pulling the nostalgia heartstrings. We tapped into influencers pretty heavily, not only to get out the message that we're open, but also to have them, sort of tell the story of what we're doing to make this a memorable summer in the face of all the, sort of travel adversity that people faced.
Yeah, that's great. I again, crazy time, especially for everyone, but definitely difficult to navigate when, so many people aren't traveling as much as they were previously. And Melissa, how about you? I think, especially from a crisis communication standpoint, how did that kind of impact and influence the way that you saw brands react to everything this year?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, V2 and probably many of those on the call today, we represent brands. Our job is to raise the visibility of the companies that we work with, both at the corporate level as well as, product level, where, we're promotion at heart, right? We're trying to get out the word about the great things that our companies are doing and the great products that they have. And it's all about, at the end of the day, it's generally about, sales. So how do you do that in light of, everything that's going on in the world, where maybe selling a product seems kind of not that important in light of racial inequities and social justice and a global pandemic? How do you do that from a how do you do that in that environment and not feel disingenuous or without hitting the wrong chord? So that's really a lot of what we spent time doing in the kind of early stages of each of these issues. Whether COVID, then came June and the death of George Floyd and what that movement that sprung. And then we're in other cycles of the election and more COVID or COVID that never ends. So how do you have these conversations and talk about your clients in meaningful ways without hitting that wrong chord? And in the early days, I really think that each of these news cycles have been kind of issues management in and of themselves, because every company had to deal with these issues as if it were their own crisis, right? So, how does a global tech company with a male, white, 50-year-old CEO respond appropriately to a social justice movement? How is that CEO authentic and kind of owning his own privilege, but also not just talking the talk but walking the walk? Like, how does that hold? And I think every company, no matter what size the company is, kind of has to respond appropriately to each of these issues, knowing that their brands will be they'll be evaluated from a rear view mirror, right? Did they respond appropriately? How well did we do? Could we have done better? And just being, really honest about that and having those conversations with all of their constituents. This isn't really just a media relations play, right? This is how are we working with our employees? How are we working with our customers? What are we saying? But what are we doing more importantly? So each of these kind of issues have been moments in time that companies have to be really self-reflective as they think about how they communicate externally with the world.
Yeah. And I love that you talk about kind of the rear view mirror now that we are actually in December and starting to reflect on the past year. And I think based on that too, thinking about lessons learned and how we can apply those, I'd love for each of you to kind of touch on how, based on your experience this year, we can help guide communicators, other reporters, anyone to kind of tackle these issues in the future. Maybe Drew, starting with you, I think social media especially, so hard to stand out. How would you kind of advise other companies to do that, and which channels might be the best to do it on?
Well, we sort of what the big win for us was really, and the big goal, like I mentioned, was keeping our customer base engaged. And so we took heavily to Instagram and Facebook. We also tapped into, and this isn't quite social media, but we consider it an extension of sort of our personal interactions, our email database. We decided to move away from salesy materials and focus more on sort of community storytelling. Our hotels are located on islands, so we have a sort of a very strong built-in community and economy there that we sort of support and ingratiate ourselves with. So we took to social media and to email to focus on individuals on the island, to spotlight them and sort of tell a community story. Because at the end of the day, the people who are visiting our hotel are not only there for us, they're there for the island themselves. So seeing those local establishments that they know and love, hearing the story of how they're coping with this unusual moment, was all a part of sort of our communication strategy, with just keeping our pretty large database of past and repeat guests engaged, involved, interacting with our brand in a time when they couldn't necessarily be with us. We also, like I said, pulling the heartstrings was definitely something. We went straight to the jugular with nostalgia. On social, we ran a pretty successful campaign that we called My Vintage Summer. And the goal for it was there were two goals. One was obviously to keep our customer base engaged with us, but we also wanted to give people that feeling of what summer vacation is all about. The call to action was basically, at the end of the day, it was a very simple photo submission campaign. But the purpose was to get people to open up their family photo albums, scroll through their phone, find old vacation photos that sort of warmed their heart and felt right and hit that spirit, and submit them for a chance to be featured in our summer advertising campaign. And we set out to pick one winner. We ended up running it for the entire summer. We had 5 winners that we ended up picking. We had this fantastic and incredibly unique marketing collateral that came out of it, because what we did was we took these people's vintage summer photos. You know, some were 75 years old, some were 10 years old, and we turned them into these really stunning posters that we then put to use on paid social, in print. But the point of it was really just to get people, you know, in touch with that feeling, and that was really the takeaway success that we had there. And when we were able to open up, you know, we heard those stories from people. They said, you know, it was so much fun flipping through our photo albums again, and sort of, you know, it was warming to hear that the effect was achieved, which was, you know, to get those emotions flowing. So that was one of our more creative approaches put to use. And I mean, at the end of the day on social media, when you talk about, you know, how would you counsel somebody moving forward and what would you recommend, it really is those sort of unique interactive moments that you can have with the customer. Obviously you can't reach out and, you know, have that conversation one-on-one, but creating that feeling of a personal dialogue is definitely something that we're putting in our back pocket for future use as well.
Yeah, I love that. I love the whole idea of, you know, creating those personal connections with people so they relate that to the brand. I think that's really great.
And the other thing for us is, you know, it works for a couple of reasons, because, you know, we are a summer hotel. We want people to feel that, but we're a legacy. We have a lot of legacy guests as well. In some instances, we have guests who've been coming to us for, you know, over 20 years. So it really sort of reinforced that, you know, we're a family feeling that we want people to feel when they arrive on property, and when they're thinking about us out of season as well, or in a time when they can't visit us.
That's great. I love that. And Malcolm, how about you? How about, you know, kind of lessons for companies, either as they were pitching you or coming up with story ideas, and how we can all kind of use that if we're ever thinking about pitching you in the future too?
Yeah, so I took down some notes and I'll read some of them off. And I also talked to my assignment desk as well. I think for a lot of the companies out there, the messages that you guys send, the emails, they go to reporters, and a lot of them go through the assignment desk as well. And so the assignment desk editors, it's generally a team of anywhere from 4 to 8, depending on the news agency. They scan all the emails that you guys send. Reporters might scan 60 to 70% of them. They tend to look through all of them because it's their job to assign the reporters the stories for the day. And so that's really who you're selling your ideas to for the different companies that you're representing, is not just the reporters, but also the assignment desk. And before I read off some of these notes, I think relationships is really important in all of this, establishing relationships with the reporters and or the people on the assignment desk, because that way you can reach out to them individually outside of just the blasted emails that you send. You can reach out to us on an individual basis, and that cuts through some of the red tape that stands there in getting stories onto TV, which is the end goal when you're reaching out to us. So some things I wrote down: offer us something that we can use that's readily available. There are often times where we get pitches that are good stories, but when we act on them, there might not be sound available to us, or the video, what we call B-roll, background video, might not be available right then and there. And so the question becomes, how can I tell a story if one of those two things is not readily available? If it were radio and we just needed sound, that'd be okay, because the video wouldn't be needed. Or if it were just video and not sound, which is a medium that doesn't even exist, you know, these things might work, but we kind of need both, and we need them as soon as possible. And if we can act on it that day, all the better. I would say come prepared and have something that we can use on TV as soon as possible. Try to be timely and offer a story that, again, can be done that day. And then concise subject lines versus something like for immediate release. The shorter and more concise you are in that subject line, the quicker you get my attention. Let me see. Something that's easy to read and simple and to the point. The quicker that you get to your who, what, when, and where is always better for me, because then I know what it is that I might be covering, where it is that I could possibly be covering it, and who I'm talking to. The better the visuals are, the more likely we are to cover the story. because it's more appeasing to the viewer, of course. And then, of course, during this current time, you want to pitch stories that are current and relevant. So anything under the umbrella of COVID, politics, and racial justice are going to get our attention. And then if I could, I'm going to pass it off after this. You know, I've been scanning through these PR emails constantly in preparation for today. And if I read one paragraph that I got from this company, I'm not sure where they're based out of. Yeah, it doesn't say where they're based out of. But this is an example of what's not going to work. Incredibly wordy, it's lengthy, right? And so it's about mental health during the holiday season. And it reads, the first paragraph, the holiday season will look a lot different for most of us. This year especially, a lot of people will be alone, away from family and friends, at a time when depression and suicide is at an all-time high. And social media may be our only connection. However, as more and more areas of our country are putting additional restrictions in place, keeping people at home, mental health professionals are linking many of the mental health issues among Americans to social media. Now that paragraph is all well and good, but all I needed was the last sentence. And it's not even the entire sentence, just half of the last sentence after the comment reads, mental health professionals are linking many of the mental health issues among Americans to social media. Therein lies the thesis. Everything before that was warming me up to the idea of what you want to talk about. And that's sweet. The reporters just don't have the time to be buttered up. And so if you get to the point, there's a better chance that your story is going to make it on TV.
Yeah, I think that is such good advice for all of us. I know sometimes we'll get to the point of pitching and we realize, you know, once we go back to proofread, we can cut out so much and get to the bottom of it. And it's helpful to hear that from you too. And we know that, you know, many reporters are being inundated with so many more pitches now than ever before. So I think that's really great advice. And I guess as a follow-up too, I would ask you how much of what you're covering is dictated by pitches as opposed to just needing to be so on top of the news cycle? Are you kind of able to take new angles beyond the topics you listed, or is it pretty much squarely in that focus area and you pick up whatever you get assigned to?
Well, right now we're in a unique time where 95% of what we're covering has to do with COVID and racial injustice and politics. I think when we get past that, there's going to be a higher propensity for us to cover stories outside of those 3 to 4 topics. But right now, especially in America, COVID is running the news cycle, and it's because, unfortunately, fear drives people's attention. And there was a recent study that said in the United States, our coverage of COVID is worse than it is in other countries. And that's because it's selling, it's getting across. And so if your company has a story that's COVID related, I can think of some that I've recently seen, like less people are using birth control during COVID. More people are likely to have long distance relationships during COVID. Shipping companies are still working to try and get every component of their shipping lines in order to still work during COVID. Every single facet of our country is impacted by this. And so if your company has been in one way or another, that's where I think we can kind of come together.
That's great. That's very great advice.
If I could pick up on that, it's interesting, Malcolm, to hear you as a journalist kind of reiterate what Nicole and I found when we were doing a lot of the kind of research for the report we issued this fall. And, we actually looked at share of voice and to see which topics were getting the most coverage. And, we really, you have validated what we were seeing in our own research. And the advice that we've been giving to clients is, how, and going back to the point of some of this, this dialogue is, how do you create awareness or get attention for your company or client in a news cycle like this? And the advice that we've been looking for is finding relevant stories within our companies that have under the context of COVID, of racial justice, but thinking about these major macro themes and what stories do we have to tell? How are we personally connected to these stories? Not just what products do we have to sell that fit into this category? How does this tech, solve for COVID, right, for example? But more broadly, opening the kimono of our company to say, how are these issues impacting us personally, and what are we doing as a company in connection with some of these macro trends?
Yeah, and you used two words that stood out to me: personally connected, and Drew touched on it as well. It's connecting with people on a human level, and where are those stories that we can tell that really touch people? Because we're in such a difficult time right now that if we can tell real stories that matter to real people, as still thousands of people are unemployed, thousands of people have lost loved ones, those are the stories that are going to make a difference. And so if there is a pitch within your company that has to do with real life issues, I think that's all the more intriguing as a journalist.
So Malcolm, you kind of touched on a mistake of what not to do when pitching you. I think it might be interesting to hear from Drew and Melissa on that as well, kind of mistakes you've seen people make on social media and crisis communications, or, kind of guiding the opposite of advice, kind of what you shouldn't do for sure. And maybe Drew, you can start from the social side.
Sure. Well, one thing that we knew immediately that we didn't want to do was remain silent. And I think that would have been the biggest mistake for us to make. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is we also knew that there would be industry stories coming out saying, we were right in the crosshairs at the beginning of this, as you mentioned. So we knew there'd be interest on the reporter side on what hotels in our region are doing to, cope with and mitigate the bleakness of the situation. So attacking it with creativity and just being, showing that the lights were on, if not in the hotels, but on, our various channels, was one of our ways of standing out. So when those reporters started knocking on our door and asking us those questions, we had lots to say. So it was, it was as much for the customer as it was for, our own sort of thought leadership within our space. But I really do think that, there were competitors within our market who didn't really have that same coordinated approach. And I think what really was so the win for our team was when this all hit the ground, we didn't just sort of sit there on our hands. We immediately put together a communication strategy. We created, different timelines based on the various, opening potentials over the course of the summer. We had a plan in place in case we couldn't even open this summer. So it was, immediately hitting the pavement with a plan, but also putting that plan in action, was what kept us sane, what kept our customers sane, and I think what set us up for when the moment was right to have all this in our hands and have this creative, initiatives to talk about. So I think waiting for the moment for you to involve yourself, or trying to be reactive instead of proactive, is definitely what I would advise against. We were fortunate to set ourselves up so that when things opened up, we were, invigorated as ever, basically. So just staying active, staying on top of your own story and communication, and not letting that, take a back seat while you wait for the world to solve itself. And that is imperative, I think.
Yeah, I think that's great. I love the idea of being proactive, not reactive, and not, don't be silent. I think that's great advice. Melissa, how about you? Any, mistakes jump out that you saw companies make, or what not to do that we can leave our viewers with?
Well, I agree with Drew. I think not going silent during these issues. We can't wait for, like you said, for the world to solve itself. If it's not one thing, it's going to be another. So we need to be, I think, still steady with the communications and what we need to be talking about as companies and brands. Just being sensitive to, a different context that we might be operating in. I think the mistakes that I've seen is companies, for example, trying to be apolitical or not political, trying to stay away from the fray, but somehow stepping in it on mistake, right? So I think about examples like, and I hope, nobody from Whole Foods is here, but, I think about the issues like when Whole Foods, and I think this was local, Malcolm, where we had Whole Foods managers in a store preventing their employees from wearing, like, Black Lives Matter face masks, right? Because it was against company policy. And I think something like that in hindsight was the wrong move, right? It wasn't the intent. They're trying to stay, whoever made that decision was trying to say, oh, we don't want to be political, we don't want to step in that fray, but they'd be better off kind of letting it go. That letting it go was more apolitical than making a move that actually made a statement in and of itself. And I don't think that was their intent. It was the outcome, right? So just being really cognizant of the decisions that we make and how they might be perceived differently than they might have been a year ago.
That was a local story, and such a great point. I don't want to give advice on anything that I'm not inclined or suited and positioned to do so. But as you mentioned, Nicole, we'll be looking at these things through the review, and you say, well, where did Whole Foods stand on that? Were they supportive of Black Lives Matter and inclusion, which is something that we believe them to be? And Jeff Bezos has always seemed to be all encompassing when it comes to his procedures and organizational structure as a company. As it pertains to Whole Foods and Amazon and Washington Post. So are they for it or are they not? And it caused a lot of uproar here in the Boston community, and we covered it pretty vigorously for several days because they didn't really take a stand one way or the other. And it caused for a decent amount of demonstrations outside of local Whole Foods.
Yeah, and I think just, accumulation of all of the advice that the three of you just gave, I think the big lesson out of 2020 is we're going to remember the brands who had strong communication strategies because they either commented on these things or they didn't. And if they failed to, and if they failed to really be proactive and thoughtful and try to drive for that personal connection, that's how they'll be remembered, unfortunately. So hopefully that's a lesson I think all of us as communicators will take into 2021 as well.
Yeah, certainly 2020 definitely put a fine point on that issue, but that's something that's actually always been the case, right? I think about,
yes,
it was a couple of years ago, actually, Starbucks faced an issue with two Black men were arrested for being in a Philadelphia, I believe, Starbucks. A worker had called the police on them for loitering, and it was kind of blown out of proportion. And I think Starbucks did a really great job at responding to that situation. That this was, making sure that the incident wasn't portraying the broader view of the company. And what they did, they actually took a stand, and I can't remember, it was a couple of years ago, so it might have been a week or two later, but they basically shut down 8,000 stores, right? All of their stores to do bias training, right? They put their money where their mouth was, right? And that's, I think, the important thing. And that's what I remember about that incident, right? I mean, obviously it was a terrible thing that happened in a local store, but that incident didn't end up defining the brand and how the brand responded.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think you're right. It's always been important, of course, but I think this past year especially we'll have a lot of those brands in mind. I know we have about 10 minutes left, and I think, Amanda, we wanted to open it up to audience questions at this point, correct?
We sure do. So
Awesome.
If you have a question, please raise your hand or send it in the chat, and I'll grab you to take you off mute.
No questions might be a first for a PR Club webinar that I've been on.
We gave them all the information they needed.
That must be it.
Got a question for you. This question is from Malcolm. What kind of subject headlines for pitches do get your attention generally?
Mm-hmm.
Short and to the point, and an idea that's going to sell. I know that's a very vague, broad answer, but you know a good one when you see one. And sometimes I'll get emails that say external on them because I think Microsoft Office is able to detect whether it's an in-house email or from outside of the company, and those tend to get my attention. I don't know why, but I know it's not someone that I work with that's just emailed me. But if it's a catchy phrase or a question, even you pose a controversial question in the subject, that might catch my attention. Or something that stands out about your story, right? So like that thesis line of the story, the one I talked about earlier was about social media and mental health. So you could pose a question, how is social media adversely affecting our mental health during COVID-19? Or is social media poorly impacting our mental health during COVID-19? Or studies show social media is having X impact during COVID, right? Like it only takes so many words. And the more of them you use, the less likely you're gonna get me. But that's me though, like it's all subjective. There's a reporter out there who probably loves a bunch of words. I'm just not the one. So I don't wanna speak for the journalism community as a whole. I'm just Malcolm Johnson.
Great, thank you, Malcolm. Next question also for Malcolm. Is there such a thing as COVID fatigue? So too many COVID related PR pitches when it comes to the news cycle, and would fresh topics be welcomed right now by journalists?
I'd welcome them, absolutely. And I think a lot of other people would, but the fact is, if you watch a newscast, the A block is what matters. The A block is the first 12 minutes of a newscast. Most of them are going to be COVID centered. And so with that, I think the idea becomes, how can we pitch a story within our company that is COVID related, that is going to make a mark? And so you can pitch other stories, but truth be told, you're not going to find many reporters who pitch that story in their editorial meeting, which I have in about an hour and 20 minutes in their meeting, because it's not something that is a lead story. And the stories we're looking for are the ones that are going to lead newscasts. And every day I'm competing with my colleagues about the best lead story that I can bring to my editorial meeting. And if it's not COVID centered, it's got to be pretty big, because this is the biggest story of our lifetime, I think.
So I've got two more questions. One for Malcolm, but I'm going to give you a break for a second and go to this other question first, so everyone can kind of have a chance to jump in. How can brands balance hopeful, forward-looking messaging with the tough and present reality of day-to-day? So Nicole, if you want to direct your moderation to our other panelists.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, Melissa, if you wanted to kind of start here, I feel like you might have a good take.
It's funny, I thought Drew would have the best answer for this, but I'll start for him. He has something like really exciting to look forward to, like summer. No, but I do think I go back to the idea that we still have stories to tell. There's still important information that we can be sharing about our businesses. Sometimes they have, a bend towards some of the macro trends like COVID. Other times they're outside of that. But I think we have to push forward, right? We've got to be able to tell those stories. And if we can put a hook to the macro trends that'll get somebody like Malcolm to pay attention, that's what we need to do in an authentic and genuine way. Not, I don't think we should, be COVID washing everything, right? That's not my advice. But certainly pitching what we have to talk about in the context of our reality. But, I think about solutions, right? So the question being about being forward-looking and hopeful. Let's talk about the after, right? What comes next? What are the opportunities that we have coming out of these types of crises? What are the big stories that we have to tell that solves for some of these problems? That's the approach that I would take.
For us, I'll jump in. For us, it was, the hard, cold reality was what is on everybody's mind from our customers' perspective, which is, what are you guys doing to keep me safe while we're with you? And that was a hard one to answer, because there's so much that we're doing, but we don't just want to give you a rap sheet of like, well, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. For us, obviously we populated as many pieces of communication as we could with that rap sheet, but we sought to bring it to life by using social influencers in our instance. where we have a very robust social influencer program, and we like to think of it as micro PR, which is really what it is. And we also like to think of these people as a network of, influencers within our family of brands. These are people, the average, length of a relationship with an influencer we have is a minimum of 2 stays. And if we like the work they're doing, we continue obviously to work with them. So in this case, we came, we arrived in this COVID moment with all this information to tell, with this really wonderful family of influencers who knew us and an audience to come with it that know us through that influencer. So we were able to, sitting on an empty hotel, we're able to bring in a very high volume of these people in a concentrated period of time right before our season started. I think we had something like 17 influencers in a 2-week period stay between our 2 open resorts at the time. And they were able to tell a very authentic, they were able to bring that rap sheet to life essentially. Because on top of the cold hard facts, which are, we're doing, we're going the extra mile to make sure that everything is clean and sanitized. We also had this whole suite of new amenities that we're offering to mitigate the fact that we couldn't have a full dining room in the summer, and all the things that our guests know and love were changing. So we needed to not only tell people what was happening to keep them safe, but we also needed to tell this authentic story of what is happening this summer to make it fun, keep things enjoyable, and keep things very summer-like. So we were fortunate to have in some instances 3 to 4 year relationships with some of these influencers, and that trust factor is built in there. So we wanted to capitalize on it in an authentic way, and blitzing everybody's Instagram feed with our brand and our hotel through these influencers. Not only was a communications win, but it was actually a huge, from my perspective, I'm very proud of our influencer program, but we've never really used it as a monetization. It's so hard to track revenue and return on influencers. But this particular season, we were able to track, up to, I think, $40,000 worth of revenue that we got from this. So it was sort of a twofold win. We were able to really legitimize this very abstract idea of making money on the impressions we earned from these people, while also telling sort of a creative and well-crafted story about how we're keeping people safe and what we're doing to make sure this summer is equally as memorable as those in their past. So that was a big segment of our strategy this summer, and it paid off, paid dividends. But it's a relationship game, very much so. And having those people sort of arm in arm with us in that critical moment was hugely important.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, just to be able to correlate the revenue brought in by said influencer and really be able to see how those two connect. If I could just jump in briefly, as this person talked about forward thinking and moving forward, after the pandemic of 1918, we had the Roaring 20s, and people went crazy and they lived it up, right? And so if we were to look at this like a game, we might just be at halftime, as we know that the vaccine is about to begin being disseminated globally, praise God. And so we say, we're getting closer to the end of this tunnel, right? And so maybe your company has some ideas about what that looks like on the other end. And maybe those are some of the stories that you start to pitch, those positive stories, because people want to get out. The Vineyard was still packed this year. I couldn't believe how many people were on Oaks Bluff in Vineyard Haven this past summer. Although cases were down, people were still out. And so I look and I say, all right, this time next year, next Christmas, Lord willing, things will be a lot closer to normal. And so maybe your company has some ideas or is doing some things or thinking down the pipeline about what that positive space looks like that we are all so eager to get to. And maybe that's the story that we begin to start to tell. As we know, the winter is going to be ominous. Just listened to the CDC director as recently as yesterday saying it could be the hardest time in human health history between December and February. So I think there is an eye for positivity, and now might be the window to try and start pushing it out there.
I know we're right at time. We've got a couple other questions with some common themes. So I'm going to paraphrase if our attendees don't mind, and if our panelists can hang on for another minute or two. Is that okay? Great. So the questions that I'm kind of combining is, for enterprise tech companies, even if they're based in Boston, or if they're not, like what is going to help get them coverage in a local market? Does there need to be a local hook right now? Does there need to be a COVID related solution for a workplace? How can, you know, an enterprise company that might serve their customers globally break through in local news right now?
I'll go ahead and take that question. I can't say I've done many tech stories recently, so I'm sorry. And I wish I could offer more on that. We've done a lot of stories with biotech companies, of course. So Moderna to Thermo Fisher to Pfizer, which has a hub here in Cambridge. Biotech, we've done a lot of as we continue the vaccine race, but tech in particular, I can't say I've done many stories with.
But I think I think the reason why we put the call to Malcolm on that is I would think you would agree that if we're trying to get local coverage, we've got to come to you with a local angle, right? I mean, yeah. You're looking at maybe macro trends, but things that are impacting our community here and how that's connected.
100%. I'll get pitches to talk to people who are in Arizona or in Minneapolis, you know, experts on said topic, but that doesn't do me any favors. I report to people in the Boston, New England region. And so if we have people who are here, like we've done stories with TripAdvisor, which has a base here based on how many people they let go earlier during the pandemic. If there are offices and experts that you have here, that is much more advantageous for both of us.
And then finally, final question for Malcolm. Do you find it beneficial, or do you prefer when a pitch starts by connecting to a recent article or something that you've done and personalize it that way? Or do you just want everyone to get straight to the point? Like, you don't care if they've read anything or watched anything you've done, just give you the thesis. What's your preference?
And Drew and Melissa, I want you guys to join in as much as possible. I don't want to take the stage.
We all want to hear from you too, so it's okay.
For me, it's just get to the point. And that's just because I'll tell you guys, as a nightside reporter, my story changes possibly 3 to 4 times a night. And yesterday, thankfully, it was one. There was a woman with 2 children who was saved in the South End apartment. That's a harrowing story from the Boston Fire Department who was able to save her. You're not going to get moved from that. But on many occasions, I have 2 to 3 stories a night. And so I say, and the emails are easily between, on one shift, 75 to 110. On one shift, that's just in an 8-hour period, right? I don't know if that's a lot. I can't compare that to other industries, right? And so I say, if you get to the point, that helps me out a lot. And I can read it, I can scan it, and I can determine if this is something we can work on or not. And then another thing while I'm here, I just thought about it. If we do work together and you're in PR, let's keep the contact going. Just text me on the side or email me on the side. If you get that one story and that relationship is established, stay in my network and I'll stay in yours. I'll reach out to you, and then we have something and we can continue to build and work together. You no longer have to email me with the filler. You can just hit me up. I'm not fine. And it's that way for most reporters.
All right, well, I think that's probably a good place to stop for now. Attendees, if you have other questions, please send them to the PR Club, and we will see what we can do to convince our lovely panelists to share further insights. Thank you all so much for your time today, both those who attended and to our panelists. We really appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.